Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where you'll be introduced to insights, tools, and strategies to leverage creative living and giving. I'm your host, Donna Kim Brand, creative brain trainer and legacy strategy coach. I help change makers and professionals who are deciding what's next to develop their thinking, learning, creativity, and collaboration skills, along with leadership mastery for meaningful impact in their next phase of life. The guests and show content I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This will help you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcase some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen up your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Well, you might recognize once you begin speaking the voice of a previous guest. He's been on a few times. His name is Douglas Brand. Now, Douglas is a retired career police officer from United Kingdom, England, he was a beat cop in London for quite a number of years, and then took a senior position in Northern England, also out on the streets with the people and keeping the peace. Now, he's also been the UK representative for the European Union in terms of policing, and was in charge of writing and I don't know if I have the right title, the conflict management manual for policing throughout the European Union. And since so-called retirement, he has worked in post-conflict stabilization, and think about what that means, in the likes of Baghdad, Iraq, Ethiopia and Darfur, Sudan, Palestine, Nigeria, and Kenya. He is currently working on his doctorate through Oxford University. So welcome, Douglas Brand.
Well, it's good to be back.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So fill us in, please. You've just returned from a stint in Kenya. So catch us up on a little bit of background about what you're doing in Kenya in the first place and in the second place.
Okay, well, first, Kenya came onto my horizon, or came onto my radar, when I was studying for my first degree in the history of political ideas. I did that at London University, and I did a comparison in colonial terms and the decolonization process between Ghana, or Gold Coast as it was, and Kenya. So that was many years ago, but the interest in Kenya has stuck with me. So when I had the opportunity as a former senior police officer to go as the advisor to the Inspector General in a newly created post following a new constitution in 2010, I jumped at and I was doing that from 2014 to 2017. You mentioned the University of Oxford and my PhD research there, and that actually is the reason I'm back in Kenya, or was back in Kenya, because what I'm looking at is the capability of the Kenya police nationally to reform itself. And so I was conducting interviews, looking at people and how they operate, and also talking to people outside of the police to see whether or not any of the work, considerable amounts of work that had been done on reform, was actually making any difference. So that was an interesting exercise. But one of the trickiest things for me was to sort of manage to try and keep my researcher hat on as opposed to putting my advisor hat back on, because many of the people that I interviewed, people I worked with, some I'd call protégés, and sometimes it's quite difficult to sort of stand off and just be an objective researcher, when in fact actually what you want to do is just to tune them up a little bit on what they could be doing in terms of reform.
Right. Now, this idea of reform and in the Kenyan police, was that something that you noticed from your years working there with the top police officer who you referred to as the Inspector General? Was that something that was on their radar before you got there, or is this something you're coming in with from the outside as a PhD candidate doing the research?
Well, I think one of the critical things, and probably some of your listeners will remember that in 2007, 2008, Kenya, which in Africa is seen as one of the more stable countries, collapsed into disorder, killing, rioting, surrounding the election process. And whereas there'd always been difficulties when it came to elections, this one tipped everybody over the edge, and there were hundreds of people killed, hundreds of thousands displaced. And as a result of that, I think the world woke up and suddenly realized, crikey, this is happening in Kenya, which we always thought was one of those stable places. And so consequent to that, there was a number of different delegations of sort of top world leaders trying to sort of sort out what the challenges were, and ultimately some commissions of inquiry, and that led to the architecture for a new constitution, the first new constitution since independence in early 1960s. So it was a big deal, and particularly when I started to read the Constitution, they created this role of Inspector General, which was to manage the whole of the National Police, because it's structured in several different formats. But most importantly, a requirement in law, in Constitution, to be more accountable to the public. So this is an African country that has a habit of what one might call less than liberal policing, some quite coercive activities, many of which were inherited from the colonial masters from the 1960s. And this requirement then to completely change. So the second Inspector General, who was the one that I spent most of my time, had really grasped his mandate, and between us we worked on how he could actually get his message across to the people at the point of service delivery in local police stations and that sort of thing. And that was a really exciting time to be there, because the Inspector General was quite a visionary and quite a strategic thinker.
So what was his message that he was trying to get across at the local level? And was he a lone voice, or, I mean, don't you have to start also within the organization?
Well, it's interesting, because in any organization, when you're trying to invoke change, the most obvious thing that happens is that those, as Machiavelli would put it, those who profit by the old order see no reason at all why they should change. I remember one particular senior officer, when I sort of tried to, and I'd been difficult to work with, I tried to sort of engage with him and talk about how the future could be. And he picked off of his bookshelf a 1956 standing orders book and slammed it down onto his desk and said, there is nothing wrong with this. We don't need any new stuff. We can use what's in here. So I couldn't stop myself. I regret it now, but I couldn't stop myself by saying to him, "Okay, could you turn up the page that talks about cybercrime?" Oh. And so he and I didn't take tea, as we use the expression in English. But this is one of the critical things, and I talk about this in a number of other environments, where you can write everything down, and in this case you can have a constitution, a new constitution. You can have the legislation operationalizes the constitution. You can have the strategic documents that determine how people are going to operate. But unless you engage with the people who are providing that service themselves and engage effectively, then not much change is going to happen. And unfortunately, in many organizations I found, and this is no exception, there's a huge amount of effort and energy put into this structuring of plans. but very little engagement and investment in actually turning the people and the mindset of the people who are providing the service, turning that around to actually meet those demands.
Well, that's brought up a few thoughts that I want to follow up on. With this 1956 Standing Orders book, seems to me, given the timeline you gave us before, that would have been during the colonial period. So, they they gained independence, yet you're saying this senior officer was relying on a book based on their pre-independence systems. So is that part of the stodginess? There's still people who were around in that period that, like you say, profit from the old order, or is there something else going on?
No, I think many people, certainly the ones that I've been trying to engage with, who are very senior, and in many cases they're sort of within a year or two of retirement. They were recruited into the police at a time when probably the running of the country was at its least effective, and the use of or misuse of police, and a concept that I call in my research a rule by law rather than a rule. The rule by law meaning the people who had the loudest voices, and in the case of their second president, stepping outside of the law completely and using criminal gangs to pursue his political agenda. All of that tends to incorporate the police in one way or another. And one of the distinctions of policing that was attempted actually in the mid-1950s by a commission that was sent out from the Colonial Office in London to see what the situation was of policing was following the Mau Mau emergency, which was when many of the tribes people turned against the colonial government. The colonial governor, when presented with the findings of the commission, rejected the idea of the police being accountable to law, as they are in UK, in the motherland, so to speak, in favour of retaining power himself to direct what the police were going to do, with the consequence that when it came to the independence, the inherited situation was that the police is accountable to the strong person in charge rather than independently being accountable to the law. And they've suffered from that, I think, ever since.
Right. And I imagine Kenya is made up of quite a few tribes as well. There were also some of that dynamic going on?
Oh, absolutely, and there's it's common knowledge in the reports into the election violence that many of the attacks on Kenyan against Kenyan were tribe-based. Some of the inflammatory language that was used in vernacular radio. And I mean, you know what the power of radio is like. If you've got somebody at the other end of the radio who's telling you that this other tribe in your area is no good and they're causing all sorts of problems, and rise up and fight against them, that's actually what happened. A lot of people were killed simply by the encouragement of radio broadcasters.
Wow. So bearing that in mind, because I presume tribes still exist there, even though they've had another few decades of playing being a nation state, which we know is an artificial construct. When you look